Welcome class. In this lecture we're going to explore the diversity and roles of fungi that are important in agriculture. Here we also consider the ecological definition of fungi rather than the traditional definition. The ecological definition of fungi refers to what are mostly filamentous eukaryotes, except for the yeasts, of course. These filamentous eukaryotes grow by means of filaments, which we know are referred to as hyphae, and these hyphae grow at the very tip. Hyphae can penetrate into substrates, hence the importance of fungi as plant parasites, wood rotters, and decomposers in soil. Fungi exhibit heterotrophic nutrition with external digestion. So we know that fungi secrete digestive enzymes at the growing tip onto the substrate, break down the substrate into smaller molecules, and then they can absorb those molecules. Fungi secrete a wide range of hydrolytic enzymes that can actually digest most biological polymers, including cellulose, lignin, keratin, etc. Hence their importance as decomposers and their role in the soil ecology. And of course, plant parasites secrete compounds that facilitate their special interactions with the plants. Fungi reproduce by the formation of spores, and hence this is one of the important bases of their classification. Now, fungi defined in an ecological sense include organisms from three kingdoms that are listed here: Kingdom Protista, Kingdom Strammonophylla, and Kingdom Fungi. So an example of a fungus found within Kingdom Protista is Plasmodiophora brassicae. This is a pathogen that causes clubroot of brassicas. It's a protozoan-like organism, hence its inclusion into Kingdom Protista, but it actually produces spores in much the same way that fungi do. Kingdom Strammonophylla, the next one on the list. This is also known as Kingdom Chromalveolata, and this is a relatively new classification, so you may not have heard of this one. It's relatively new over the past 10 years or so, but this is still not reflected in your normal scientific textbooks. These are a major line of eukaryotes. Most of them are algae, but they do contain notable members here that are considered to be fungi. So, for example, we can see Phytophthora from the infamous Irish potato famine. There's also white rusts, for example, Albugo candida. And then we've also got other inclusions such as Pythium and downy mildews. So this kingdom includes some of the most important plant pathogens. Our third kingdom here is Kingdom Fungi. These are also referred to as the true fungi, and this includes most of the saprotrophic fungi found in soil, the wood rotters, mycorrhizal fungi. This is a group of fungi that form very important symbiotic relationships with plants, and also, again, some of the most important plant pathogens such as powdery mildews, rusts, and smuts. Here we have two important examples of fungi that are found in Kingdom Protista. And remember, this is the kingdom that contains algae, protozoa, and even the malaria parasite. So the example on the left shows Plasmodiophora, which causes clubroot of crucifers. And to the right, we have another fungus called Spongospora that causes the disease powdery scab of potato. Here we have some different examples of Phytophthora, different species of Phytophthora that belong to the Kingdom Strammonophylla. So to the left, we have eucalypt dieback, which is caused by Phytophthora cinnamoni. Bottom middle of screen, taro blight, caused by Phytophthora colocaceae, and bottom right of screen, cocoa pod rot, caused by another species of Phytophthora. And here's one that you'll be familiar with. This is potato late blight, caused by Phytophthora infestans. Let's look at Phytophthora in a little bit more detail. Phytophthora is a genus of microorganisms in kingdom Straminophila. Phytophthora species resemble true fungi because they grow by means of fine filaments called hyphae, and they produce spores. But unlike true fungi, their cell walls contain cellulose instead of chitin. Their hyphae lack cross walls, and also their diploid phase rather than the haploid phase dominates their life cycle. Another striking feature of Phytophthora is that they produce swimming spores called zoospores. There's currently more than 80 described species of Phytophthora worldwide, and most of them are plant pathogens. And in fact, the name Phytophthora is derived from Greek, and it actually means plant destroyer. So, of course, we're familiar with the example of Phytophthora known as Phytophthora infestans that caused the Irish potato famine of the 1840s, and is also pictured here. We also have Phytophthora cinnamoni, which infects more than 1,000 plant species, and also Phytophthora ramorum, which causes sudden oak death. So Phytophthora species are amongst the most destructive pathogens of agricultural crops in the world. Here we have another example from kingdom Straminophila. This is downy mildew of grape. Downy mildew devastated old world domesticated grapevines after it was introduced to Europe from North America, where it had co-evolved on wild grapes on which it caused very little damage. In Europe, grapes were grown as a genetically uniform or clonal monoculture of highly susceptible types. So they had lost their resistance to this particular pathogen, and this is still the case today. Let's follow the progression of downy mildew disease on grapevines. And you'll notice in the upper left photo, the initial biotrophic nature of downy mildew. So this is showing the earliest sign of downy mildew in terms of a single leaf spot every 50 metres or so of vine row. Now, if we look at the photo top right of screen, you can see the formation of more leaf spots. And often these aren't detected until the disease has spread and more of the oil spots become visible. Photo to the lower left of screen, now we can see white down, and these are spores that are developing beneath the leaf spots or oil spots, and these develop after a suitable warm humid night. Photo bottom right of screen, now we can see that the rapidly growing oil spots often merge to infect much of the leaf. Here we have downy mildew once again, but this time on cucumber. Here we have another Straminophila. This one is Albugo candida. This organism causes white rust or white blister diseases in above ground plant tissues. And while they affect many types of plants, the destructive aspect of infection is limited to just a few agricultural crops, including Brussels sprouts, cabbages, cauliflower, broccoli, spinach, sweet potatoes, and a few other crops. White rust pathogens create these chlorotic or yellow lesions and sometimes galls on the upper leaf surface, and then you have these corresponding white blister-like pustules of spores on the underside of the leaf. And you can see these white blisters of spores in two of these photos on the screen. So white rust is considered to be an obligate parasite, which means that it needs a living host to grow and reproduce. And now we have the true fungi belonging to kingdom fungi. There are 6 groups here. You've already been introduced to these. Let's look at them once again. Phylum Chytridiomycota, also known as the rumen fungi. They produce motile, asexual zoospores. Phylum Zygomycota, the spores are non-motile. These fungi produce zygospores in the sexual part of their life cycle. Next one, phylum Glomeromycota. These form mycorrhizae. And remember that mycorrhizae are these mutualistic symbiotic relationships that these fungi form with plants. Next, we have phylum Ascomycota. They produce spores called ascospores, in other words, spores in a sac. And this spore formation follows meiosis in the sexual part of their life cycle. In their asexual part of the life cycle, they produce spores called conidia. Phylum Basidiomycota form basidiospores, that is, spores on a club. And finally, phylum Deuteromycota. These are fungi lacking sexual spores. Here we have a range of different spore types, and we know that classification of fungi is based on the formation of spores. But what is a spore? A spore refers to one or more cells, usually enclosed in a protective layer called the spore coat or spore wall. And this spore can give rise to a new organism. Now let's run through these different groups of true fungi once again and add to what we already know. First one, phylum Chytridiomycota, also known as the rumen fungi. These are the simplest of the fungi. They produce what's called a zoospore, which has a single posterior whiplash type of flagellum. There are free-living and parasitic forms. They exhibit asexual and sexual reproduction. Many members of this group degrade cellulose and keratin. Which is quite important because it enables the degradation of crustacean exoskeletons. There are parasitic forms that infect both aquatic animals and plants. And the flagellum of the zoospore is thought to be a primitive feature which has been lost in the more evolved true fungi. Let's look at a few examples of members of phylum Chytridiomycota, in other words, chytrids. Syncytrium species cause false rust on winged bean. Syncytrium species also cause what's called black wart of potato. Now, potato wart is quite a serious disease of cultivated potato, and it's been detected worldwide, but generally with limited distribution because of stringent quarantine and regulatory measures. Another example here of a chytrid, a plant pathogenic chytrid, is the Opidium species. These infect roots of several plants and can even transmit viruses such as lettuce big vein virus between plants. Phylum Zygomycota, order Mucorales. This group includes many of our molds that are common soil-borne decomposers of leaf litter, stubble, etc. Members of the phylum Zygomycota also play an important role in food processing. Foods such as tempeh in Indonesia is made from boiled soybeans, that is fermentation of soybean meal by members of the genus Rhizopus. Other members of this group are used in industry to make alcohols, acids, some anaesthetics, birth control agents, meat tenderizers, the yellow colouring used in margarine, and also enzymes that are used in industry, such as lipases and proteases. Phylum Zygomycota also includes some important insect parasites. Of major importance are members of the phylum Glomeromycota. These are mycorrhizal symbionts of vascular plants. That is, these are fungi that form important mutualistic symbiotic relationships with roots of vascular plants. They form intracellular associations within the roots of almost all herbaceous plants and tropical trees. Next we have phylum Ascomycota, otherwise known as the sac fungi. And these fungi are so named because during sexual reproduction they produce a structure called an ascus, and this ascus contains haploid ascospores. One example within this phylum is the well-known brewer's yeast, that is Saccharomyces species. So members of the phylum Ascomycota can be either the filamentous forms, that is they produce hyphae, or the yeast forms. And we saw an example of that on the previous slide. Here's an example of the filamentous form, and shown here is the dung fungi, which belongs to the genus Sordaria. Phylum Ascomycota also includes the sclerotial fungi. So, for example, the fungus Claviceps purpurea, which causes ergot of cereals. And we can see in some of these images, particularly in A, B and C, where the fungus has replaced the kernels in the heads of rye, barley and wheat with its own reproductive structure called ergot sclerotia. In D, we can see ergot sclerotia from barley mixed with healthy barley kernels. And it's interesting that the chemical formula of LSD, the drug LSD, is found in ergot sclerotia. Important members of this group also include the grass endophytes. So, for example, the asexual form of genus Neotyphodium is quite unusual in that it forms a mutualistic symbiotic relationship with certain genera of grasses. So, for example, Lolium perenne as an example, that is perennial ryegrass, or members of the genus Festuca. So you'll be familiar with tall fescue, meadow fescue, and so on. So what the fungus does, it forms these alkaloid toxins, and these toxins confer on the host plant resistance to insect herbivores. In exchange, the fungus receives their nutrients from the plant. These fungi are transmitted through the actual seed of the grasses. Then what happens is that sheep that consume excessive quantities of the fungal toxin can suffer what's called ryegrass staggers. Some additional sclerotial fungi are shown here. For example, Sclerotinia sclerotiorum, Sclerotinia minor, and Botrytis cinerea. At the bottom of screen we have two images showing Sclerotinia fruticola, which causes brown rot of stone fruit. In the photo at the top right hand of screen, we can see some of these little black structures that sclerotial fungi produce, these tiny little black sclerots, and these are dormant resting structures of the fungi. In the photo to the top left of screen, you can actually see the sclerots germinating to produce these little cup-shaped structures. Some more examples of phylum Ascomycota, including the very tasty Morchella esculenta. The important powdery mildews that attack plants. Powdery mildew growth on leaf lesions. This represents the sexual stage of powdery mildew, and it contains what are called cleistothecia, which contains the fungal spores enclosed within an ascus. Mycosphaerella is an important parasite of eucalypt leaves. And Leptosphaeria maculans. You're already familiar with this fungus that causes blackleg of canola. Next we have phylum Basidiomycota. So named because during sexual reproduction, these fungi, which are also known as club fungi, form structures called basidium. These are microscopic spore-producing structures which are club-shaped. And you can see the basidia in the photo to the top right of screen. And each structure, each basidium, has already produced those spores, which are referred to as basidiospores. Phylum Basidiomycota includes the rusts, puffballs, toadstools, and both edible and poisonous mushrooms. Here are some examples of order Agaricales, which are rarely plant pathogens. Ectomycorrhizae, important mutualistic relationships that certain fungi form with plant roots. Some more examples of ectomycorrhizae. The important wood rotters, otherwise known as bracket fungi, also belong to phylum Basidiomycota. And here we have some more examples of the wood rotters, family Polyperaceae. And some final examples for you. Phylum Basidiomycota also includes the wheat rusts, genus Puccinia. And also coffee rust. In the photo at the top left of screen, you can see the rust lesions that are normally visible on the surface of the plant. At the bottom left of screen, this is one of the rust lesions which is visible, and you can now see the outer plant epidermal cells have ruptured. This structure that we see here is called a teleum, and it's ready to release these spores. The two photos on the right of screen are showing a different type of spore that's forming, and these are spores germinating inside the infected plant cells. Here we can see the different rust spore stages of wheat stem rust. Here we have the very complex life cycle of the wheat stem rust pathogen, Puccinia graminis. This produces 5 morphologically different spore types on 2 plant hosts. Wheat, which you can see to the left of that dashed line, and barberry to the right of the dashed line. And it alternates between these 2 host plants. One spore type only infects barberry, another infects only wheat. Then the remaining 3 spore types germinate to form mycelium, upon which another type of spore is formed. So the fungus never actually completes its sexual life cycle in Australia, because barberry, although it was introduced by European settlers as an ornamental plant, never really became widespread here. And also because our winters are not really cold enough to break the dormancy of one type of spore, the Telia spore, that eventually gives rise to the basidium. But nevertheless, stem rust remains a dangerous pathogen because the disease cycle in Australia involves only one spore type, the Uridinio spore, which continually affects wheat grown all year round or as a winter and spring crop. The smuts also belong to phylum Basidium mycota. Figure 1.7 shows loose smut, otherwise known as blast, of barley in A and wheat in B, and this is caused by the fungus Eustallagio. Figure 1.8 shows cover smut or bunt of wheat caused by the fungus Taletia. Just looking at the photo in A, which shows a healthy spikelet or ear of wheat, and the spikelet to the right, still in A, is infected with smaller round black wheat kernels. The photo in B shows healthy light coloured wheat kernels and also smut infected dark coloured kernels of wheat. These photos show spores and mycelium in the smut life cycle. Here we have our last group, fungi without sex, the Deuteromycota, otherwise known as the conidial fungi. This group includes about 25,000 species, many of which are considered economically important. They're quite a diverse group with very different evolutionary backgrounds, but importantly, they've lost the ability to reproduce sexually. Here we have some examples. On the left, the 2 photos to the left of screen represents Penicillium species. 2 photos in the middle, Aspergillus, and to the right, Botrytis cinerea.